The following program is a co-production of Seattle Channel and Seattle City Club and sponsored by Comcast.
Partisan politics has stoked division nationally. Can we overcome that in Washington state?
I think we first have to put aside preconceived notions that Republicans kind of drop their partisanship and give up on all of their principles.
I just think Republicans at this point have zero, none, nada ground to stand on in talking about bipartisanship.
It's all coming up on Civic Cocktail.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to March Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter, so pleased to be here with two guests who know how sharply divided our politics can be, but who also have some ideas about how we can honestly come together on a few matters. Our guests this evening are Tina Podlodowski, chairwoman of the Washington State Democratic Party, and Caleb Heimlich, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Thank you both so much for joining us. In a Super Bowl TV ad, music legend Bruce Springsteen travels to a small chapel in the center of the country to plea. We can make it to the mountaintop, through the desert, and we will cross this divide. If rock stars are modern-day philosophers, is it helpful that Springsteen urged us to become the reunited states of America? I'm going to start with you, Caleb.
Well, good evening, Joni. Thank you very much for having me on. It's great to be with you and with Tina. In talking with a lot of Republicans, what they saw in that ad, and one of, I think, the barriers to bridging the divide and bringing people together is we'll see media, we'll see cultural leaders call for unity after Democrats win. But I would argue that that ad never would have run if President Trump had been reelected. So if we're going to have real unity, if we're going to work together, I think we first have to put aside preconceived notions that Republicans kind of drop their partisanship and give up on all of their principles and come and agree with everything that Democrats want. That's not unity, and that's never going to happen. Now, I would say that I agreed with some of the themes in President Biden's inaugural address and the desire to have a civil politics moving forward, to have us work out our disagreements, to find agreement where we can.
What was a theme that you agreed with when you heard that?
Well, I think the theme in general of the idea of getting back to a politics that is a little bit less divided and where it's okay to find common ground. I think that as a theme is something that I think we should all strive towards.
Well, to that point, Tina Podlodowski, President Biden said something a little bit later than that, said something similar, and I'd like to read it to you. I take issue with what everybody says about the division. The nation is not divided. You go out there and you take a look and you talk to people. You have fringes on both ends, but it's not nearly as divided as we make it out to be. What about that, Tina Podlodowski? That's your very own president talking.
I agree with President Biden on that. Look, we need to talk about accountability and responsibility. If we want our democratic system to work again, we need to put aside what I think have become some very lazy intellectual habits that misrepresent what both partisanship is and what bipartisanship is. Nothing is more destructive to democracy in American politics right now than the misunderstandings and misrepresentations of both partisanship and bipartisanship. They're not yin and yang, they're not good and bad. Both functional partisanship and functional bipartisanship demands, at a bare minimum, the commitment to abide by the results of free elections, the commitment to tell the truth about those elections, and the commitment to make certain all citizens have equal opportunity to participate in the electoral process. The GOP, the Republicans, currently fail at all three of these things. And until they commit to those principles, functional bipartisanship is impossible. Accountability needs to happen. They've had no shortage of opportunities to commit to the Constitution, to democracy, to the opportunity for bipartisanship. They could have immediately recognized Joe Biden as the winner of the presidential election and not let the big lie that the election was stolen fester. And that still happens today. If Republicans are truly interested in being bipartisan, they would be acting very differently than they have since President Biden won the election. In Congress, they could have declined to object to any of those electoral votes in the certification of the Electoral College. They did not. They could have voted to impeach, convict, and disqualify the disgraced insurrectionist in chief, Donald Trump, if that's too subtle for folks, from holding future office, but they didn't. And the two Republican congressional members in Washington who did, Jamie Herrera Butler and Dan Newhouse. Now, I disagree with them on many policy positions and actions, but they had the courage to stand up for what is right and what is constitutional. And I applaud them for that. And for their troubles, well, they were censured by the Washington State Republican Central Committee by a vote of 111-2. So I just think Republicans at this point have nada ground to stand on in talking about bipartisanship. They have shown no signs that they're interested in that sort of collaborative politics.
Well, I will use that as the fabulous segue there. That why don't each of you define bipartisanship? What does it mean to you, Caleb? What does bipartisanship mean to you?
Well, to me, it means working together. It means recognizing that there are a variety of opinions in this country and that we can seek to find common ground. I would object to many of what Tina just said and the mischaracterizations of Republicans. I would point out that it was Democrats that have historically objected to certifying the Electoral College, including our own Congresswoman from Seattle. She objected to certifying the Electoral College in 2016. Stacey Abrams refused to concede the governor's election in Georgia in 2018. So to say that it's only Republicans or that somehow Republicans are fomenting distrust in our democracy is ludicrous. But setting aside all of that, I think fundamentally, look, the country is very divided. There are 74 million people that just voted for President Donald Trump. They deserve to have a voice in our political process. And as I said at the beginning, if the Democrats' viewpoint is that you have to abandon all of your principles, you have to give up on the people that voted for you and their concerns in order to come together, then our country is never going to come together.
Well, on this point of bipartisanship, there was an opinion piece in the New York Times last week that made me think that maybe there's a different definition than even I use. Like, we generally think that bipartisanship is when you have Democrats and Republicans in Congress joining together and voting for something, then it's a bipartisan bill. But this piece, Michelle Cottle, the editorial writer who wrote it, said maybe we should think of bipartisanship sometimes in terms of public support. So, for example, the COVID relief bill has 76% support among the American people, 60% support. This is according to Morning Consult, so it's a poll, among Republicans. What about that as a sort of different way to approach it, thinking about things in terms of public support? Tina.
I think that there is incredible support amongst the public, and hence my saying that the country isn't divided. What we have is a GOP party that had been hijacked by Donald Trump. It is still, for some reason, enthralled to him and won't stop a big lie around those different pieces of it. The public wants the COVID relief bill. They want us to come together and solve problems. But again, you cannot do that when you're not committing to abide by the results of free elections, when you refuse to tell the truth about those elections, when you're taking away from citizens equal opportunities to participate in the electoral process. Look at what happened with Stacey Abrams in Georgia. Look at all of those things. I mean, we could stop right here and just stop the big lie for Washington State. Caleb could take a start in that direction tonight and plainly declare Joe Biden was legitimately elected and denounce those in Washington State who are saying otherwise. Denounce voter suppression efforts by the GOP here in Washington and around the country. All of those are things that are the first step to getting us to sitting down and having civil conversations about this. I mean, historically, bipartisanship has been something that has emerged when crises have abounded. That was blown up by Donald Trump and his entire administration. They broke the back of bipartisanship with a lack of action on the COVID pandemic. And it'll stay that way until we can get back to something where we agree, where we have values about what's in the Constitution regarding elections and accepting elections, and what's in the Constitution about having every American have that right to vote and have that right to vote respected.
Well, one of the best things going this week, for example, on bipartisanship has to do with Merrick Garland. He is very likely to be approved by a healthy number of Republicans and Democrats, and as the new U.S. Attorney General. And so I'd like to hear this from you, Caleb. Why is Merrick Garland someone who appeals to both Republicans and Democrats?
Well, I think what you're seeing from Republicans in the Senate is they're willing to give a fair hearing. They're willing to listen to someone's credentials, to qualifications, and approve. They take seriously their role according to the Constitution of giving advice and consent. I think what you've seen in the past is Democrats blow up what used to be a bipartisan process when it comes to confirming nominees, when it comes to confirming U.S. Supreme Court nominees, when it comes to confirming some of President Trump's nominees. But I think in the case of Merrick Garland, I think you're seeing from Republicans a willingness to work across the aisle. And I'd point out that in 2020, we had two, not just one, but two COVID relief packages that passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. One of them got over 90 votes in the U.S. Senate, signed by President Trump. So this idea that Republicans are unwilling to reach across the aisle and work with the other side is preposterous. What we've seen from President Biden since he took office is over 50 executive orders not being willing to work with Republicans in any meaningful way on COVID relief, which is why you had two Democrats vote against the current package in the House. And so I think what we're seeing with Merrick Garland, again, is Republicans are willing to listen, they're willing to vet, they're willing to vote for qualified people, and we're seeing that in the case of Merrick Garland. What we're not seeing from Biden and Democrats on the COVID relief bill is a willingness to take input. Of that $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, over half of it doesn't go to anything related to COVID.
So, Caleb, apropos of nothing other than the fact that you and I discussed this, do you want Donald Trump to lead the GOP ticket in 2024?
I mean, my personal opinion is I would rather see somebody else in 2024. But, I mean, ultimately, I don't get to choose. That is a vote of the people. But I think that for the party, we would be more successful with a different candidate.
Tina, in the interest of bipartisanship and a little friendliness, can you say something nice right now about Caleb?
I think that Caleb has done a good job in leading his party in those different places. But again, I do believe that we are in a place where we just don't have a values match. Look, I asked Caleb, can he say Joe Biden won the election fair and square? He won't say that. He won't denounce people in his party.
Caleb, do you want to say if Joe Biden won the election fair and square?
Sure, I'll say, I mean, the election is over. Joe Biden is clearly the president of the United States. I think we all should value, one of the values that we should all share in common is that our election process is transparent. The reality is over 50% of Republicans right now don't believe the election was fair. So I would like to see us take steps to show the truth. If it was fair, then you should have nothing to hide. Then we should have transparency. Currently today, Democrats in the U.S. House are still contesting a congressional election in Iowa. I mean, it's not like just say that it's only Republicans that still fight out elections. So I think that fundamentally we should have confidence in the integrity of our election. We should have audits that are public and that we can show people. I think transparency will show. I've been on the record supporting Kim Wyman multiple times. I think she has done a fantastic job. I think that the elections in Washington were fair. I think the results were what they were. Our side didn't win as many as I would have liked, and we're abiding by those.
Caleb, can I get you to say something nice about Tina Podlodowski right now?
Yeah, I think she's been a very impressive fundraiser for the state Democratic Party. They've raised a lot of money, and that's my hat's off to her for that. So
your former candidate for governor in 2016, Bill Bryant, was on this show in February, and he made a pretty good case that, in general, the Washington State GOP is different from the national GOP. It's just more moderate. Do you agree with that, Caleb?
I think there is definitely a flavor of republicanism in Washington State that can be different than in D.C. Absolutely. I think we can be a little bit more pragmatic. I think, look, you could look at just this legislative session. There have been 4 or 5 big issues that we've had bipartisan support down in Olympia. There was a data privacy bill that just passed the Senate today, sponsored by Reuven Carlyle. It got 48 out of the 49 votes. So Republicans working with Democrats to protect people's privacy. You've seen Republicans in Washington State fighting for the working families tax credit. This was a policy put in place by the Democrats to give working families a tax break, and Republicans in their budget are fighting to fund it. And I think that's an area where we have some common ground and where Republicans are willing to work to address the unfairness of our tax code when it comes to those low-income, hardworking Washingtonians. So I think what I would argue is when I'm talking to people, I think Washington State Republicans have a little bit of a different flavor. And when you get to a more localized level, you're seeing some real strong leaders that are focused on pragmatic, solution-oriented leadership, like we're seeing out of Bruce Stammeier in Pierce County, like we're seeing out of Nate Nearing in Snohomish County, who was elected by his peers to chair the Snohomish County Council, by his peers being Democrats voted to have him as the chair. So absolutely, I think you see Republicans focused on solving problems, and that's our key to success in Washington State.
So I want to come back to Nate Nearing, but first I have a question for Tina Podlodowski that has to do with the divide in the Democratic Party. Some people say both parties, or at least 2 parties, or many parties within one party. The Democrats also have divides that could rear their head at any minute here, even on the COVID relief bill and the $15 minimum wage. Are you prepared for that, Tina Podlodowski?
Let me get to that in a second, Joni, but I do want to talk about a few things. And since Caleb has filibustered for a few minutes here, I hope I have the same leeway to be able to do that. Let's start with the beginning here, which is Caleb did not say that plainly that Joe Biden was legitimately elected and that he would denounce those in the Washington State GOP that are saying otherwise and would denounce voter suppression efforts. He danced around those things. He refuses to say them. He talks about bipartisanship when it comes to Merrick Garland and a fair hearing, but let's go back to what happened to Merrick Garland when he was nominated for the Supreme Court. He didn't get a fair hearing. What's the difference between right now and what's the difference between the past? Mitch McConnell, the Senate under Mitch McConnell, where all good things went to die, Mitch McConnell refused to give Merrick Garland a hearing. What's different now is that Democrats have 50 seats in the Senate and the tie-breaking vote with Kamala Harris. So let's not talk about all these wonderful things that the Republicans are doing, because they are not doing them in any way, shape, or form. Look, you talk about the different form of what's been happening in the Republican Party in Washington State. I said it before, Jamie Herrera Butler and Dan Newhouse, who I'm going to say are the Republicans that you can reach across the aisle and have a conversation with and look at how you have policies that benefit different people. Those 2 folks had the courage to stand up and do what is right and vote for the impeachment of Donald Trump. And for their trouble, the Washington State Republican Party censured them 111-2. That is not something that's close. That's not something that is in the realm of a possibility that shows anything other than a party that's extreme. I mean, we really
okay, but we're actually not here tonight to just wail on them. We're here to talk about ways that we, can come together. I think it's a legitimate question. Just a minute. I think it's a
I think it's legitimate for Caleb to reconcile these very important issues that are.
But let me do the questioning. And so the question that you've raised in a way, and I'll take it a little bit further here, is that when we talk about bipartisanship or getting along better, it is true that a bigger tent is better for each of your parties. So because you need independence to get elected around here. So on the point of Jamie Herrera Butler and Dan Newhouse, Caleb, I get the sense that you have kind of mixed feelings about how they've been treated. I don't know that you'll say that, but I'm just asking you, do you have mixed feelings about that?
Tina's mischaracterizing what took place. And so, I mean, I'm not going to take a lecture from someone who has no idea about the inner workings of the Republican Party on what allegedly transpired. The vote was to express displeasure with the impeachment of President Trump. There was no official censure of Jamie and or Dan. So we will see what happens going forward. Look, I think that Jamie and Dan are going to have to make their case to the voters of their district, and the voters of their district will decide who represents them. And that's what's going to happen going forward. I mean, the Washington State Democratic Party censured Guy Palumbo because he supported charter schools. So to say that there's only one party that takes extreme positions is just not true.
One of the toughest features of politics today for me as a journalist is this issue about truth. You know, as an editorial writer, I'm very comfortable, you know, sort of arguing points about things, but the argument over the truth, and I do want to point out, Caleb, that you did support Kim Wyman in her, you know, stating what the election results were. But nationally, there still is a perpetuation of the idea that Joe Biden wasn't elected. So for the purposes of this show, and what's very important to me is how do we get to the truth? I would like to hear you, Caleb, address that. How do we get back to the truth?
Well, I think first, so I mean, to answer the question, like, yes, Joe Biden, I said that. Joe Biden is the president. He won the election. So I'll give you that, period. And two, I'm certainly not in favor of voter suppression. What I am in favor of is fair, transparent elections. And we should all be in favor of that. And so,
what do you mean by that? Are you calling for some sort of investigation of the election?
I'm saying in general, the process should be transparent. I think what we saw when you're kicking observers out, that is not a transparent process. And so we should all be supporting more transparency into where our results are coming from, how the ballots are counted, what the process is, what the signature verification processes are to protect from fraud. Because fraud does occur. And so I think we want to put safeguards in place to stop that from happening. I think we should all agree that ballot harvesting shouldn't be happening. And so I think when you're talking about how do we come to truth, one of the ways you come to truth is have the process out in the open so that people can see it, so people can observe it. And if there's transparency, sunshine is the best disinfectant, and people will see, okay, that is the results. So that's what I support. As you said, I've supported Secretary Wyman multiple times. I supported her in 2016 when she won overwhelmingly in this state. I supported her in 2020, and I've supported her since. And she has said herself that there was some voter fraud even in Washington State in 2018. They had 130 some documented cases.
She told me that the percentage of fraud in the 2018 election was 0.04. Now it exists, but out of the total number of ballots, nearly 4 million that were cast, that's not a big number. So
you're right.
Tina.
It's not a big number, but it happens. And I'm saying we should take the steps to prevent it from happening. And if we take the steps to show the transparency of how the process actually works, I've said it before, I'll say it right now. We have a great election system in Washington State. So I think the more transparency we have, the more we showcase that to people, then you eliminate and you help them see the truth.
So let's just hear let's just repeat what Caleb has said. Caleb has said that election fraud exists. There have been study after study after study to show that election fraud does not exist in this country. He has refused to say that Joe Biden won this race fair and square. He says Joe Biden has won the race. I'm sorry, let me finish, please, because Caleb has filibustered on this particular issue. He has a King County chair in Joshua Freed who has started an election integrity commission. He's asserting that mail-in ballots cause fraud. This is the Washington State GOP saying this. So let's talk about this when you talk about truth, Joni, and the big lie and how you get to bipartisanship. You can't get to bipartisanship if fundamentally you have someone lying over and
Tina,
over.
if fraud doesn't exist, then why did Stacey Abrams not concede in 2018?
Over and over again, you have somebody lying about this, and the Republican Party does. They will not accept the results of the election. They will
Will
not
you accept the Georgia 2018 elections? Will you encourage your party to accept the Iowa 2 congressional district elections that they're challenging right now? Like your party is challenging a congressional election in Congress right now.
This is not whataboutism. This is
this is a fact.
No, this is not whataboutism. This is about the fundamental component of what makes a democracy and how you can make this happen and do this work from both the right part of partisanship and the component of bipartisanship.
So I'm gonna move this. Points made, points taken on both sides completely. But I am going to move this along to something that I wanted to get back to, and that is the Snohomish County Council, because when I was speaking with Caleb, he said, one way to turn the temperature down is to talk local, think local. So in local government, as we know, we all want basics. We want parks, we want the recycling picked up, and we do have this example in Snohomish County where, they pick among themselves their chairperson each year, and they picked Nate Naring. The Democratic-controlled Snohomish Council picked a Republican. And so why is that hopeful? First Caleb, and then Tina, I'd love to hear you talk about that as well.
Well, I think it's hopeful because it shows that people can work together. And like you said, when we get to local levels, Republicans care about parks too. Republicans care about the garbage being picked up on time. Republicans care about safe communities for their kids. Republicans care about good schools. So there are a lot of issues where we do actually agree, and we're not as divided. And that's where I'd agree with what President Biden said. There is some areas of agreement in this country, and I think the more localized you get, the more you're able to find that level of agreement. And I think this whole conversation so far in a half an hour, Tina wants to turn everything to Washington, D.C., and that's what she wants to talk about. And that's frankly what Democrats do surrounding elections in Washington state. Everything is always about Trump. Everything is always about D.C. instead of talking about local issues, local concerns. And if we do that, it does turn down the temperature a little bit. And frankly, Republicans have been more successful in winning around those issues.
Tina?
Yeah, I think we're talking about two different sets of values here, right? The vast majority of Republicans, including here in Washington state, when you think about the Senate Freedom Caucus, Doug Erickson, Mike Padden, Phil Fortunato, Jim McCune, when you think about people like Robert Sutherland and Jim Walsh and their bombastic pronouncements, they don't have an actual governing agenda. In fact, since they hate our constitutional form of government so much, maybe they should stop trying to run it. The Republican Party has spun off to a culture war and grievance party. And that's because of a distraction from their lack of direct policies that would improve the lived lives and economic opportunities of all voters in Washington state. Or look at it another way. The GOP is trying to distract voters from its fundamental opposition to achieving those goals of equity and equality. What you're doing is cherry picking a few folks in the same way that Caleb has been cherry picking different ways of talking about different things. But fundamentally, the vast majority of what we're seeing out of the GOP is a party in Washington, D.C. and Washington state that does not reflect the values of the people who live here and does not reflect bipartisanship, and in fact, does not even reflect the partisanship of the Republican Party historically in Washington state. It reflects an extreme agenda. And in every way imaginable, they are trying to push through a very extreme agenda.
Tina, when you see something happen that's bipartisan in the legislature, does it make you happy to see that the parties could work together? And do you have an example of that?
Well, Joni, so how are you defining bipartisanship in that case? That means people are voting for something. That's great. It doesn't mean
It
that
could be public support or the two parties working together. That's how I define
doesn't
it.
mean that
Either of the definitions that we've been
Right.
discussing.
It doesn't mean that Republicans did any work on any of the bills or any of the lift to make sure that these policies are in place. So let's think about something that's really important for Washington state, which is broadband and having broadband throughout the state of Washington. It's a rural issue, it's an urban issue, it's a suburban issue, it's an equity issue, it's a systemic racism issue in many ways as well. Broadband and the bills that are passed through there have gone through with the support of both parties. But would I call that bipartisanship? No, it's not as though the Republicans have been advocating for this in any way. They happen to vote on those particular bills.
That's fine. That's just not true.
I want to hear Caleb on this. I want to hear Caleb.
Well, that's not true that Republicans haven't been fighting for broadband. Jacqueline Maycomer has been advocating for that for years. I mean, she's a representative from northeastern Washington. She's been meeting with cable companies, met with the president of Microsoft, has been advocating for it in the legislature. So I know you don't want to give any credit to Republicans for anything, and apparently that goes like it's so countercultural for you, but it's just not true. So you can't spout lies about what Republicans aren't doing when they are doing those things.
I am really tired of the lies coming out of the Republican Party about what they're doing and how they're advocating for any of these sorts of issues and for the fundamentals of democracy. Look, this whole whataboutism in terms of trying to compare this is absolutely wrong. And Joni, you went back to talking about partisanship and this idea that I think is really bad, that partisanship is bad, bipartisanship is good. Partisanship is something that is essential to a functioning democratic system. You know, in any healthy society, people are going to disagree about what they value the most. Whether it's liberty, equality, community, and even when they agree on values, citizens are going to differ about which priorities and policies best advance them. So, but if you want to have agreement on certain fundamentals, and that has to be a shared commitment to the truth, a shared commitment to an electoral system that values the truth and not lying about the system when you lose. You have to make sure that all voters are part of that system and that the elections are not rigged through voter suppression. The disagreement, progressive versus moderate, ambition versus incrementalism, you know, that's been described as dysfunction. It's not. In fact, it's the beating pulse of a healthy party and healthy debate. There are people within the Democratic Party, to go back to your earlier question, who provide ideological energy, like our own Pramila Jayapal, who chairs the Progressive Caucus. At the same time, we have folks who are looking at issues and how to balance and compromise and achieve those goals, like our own Susan DelBene, who's the chair of the New Democratic Caucus. So the Democratic Party comes from a place of value.
We have both of them on our next show, so we're excited about that. But
okay, I want to solve these problems and not lying about the fundamentals in terms of our entire system, what's constitutional, and what makes sense to gain access for all people. That's
Caleb. Do you have an answer to this, or or I'll move along to?
Well, I mean, just real quick. Again, it's rich to be lectured on all of this by somebody whose party spent the last 4 years claiming that the 2016 election was rigged by Russia. So, you can't now say all of a sudden that it's irresponsible to not immediately accept the results of an election. The Democrat narrative for the last 4 years was that it was totally rigged.
That's a whole nother lie when the intelligence community is telling you all of these things. Here is the point again in terms of values and accepting the truth. You're going to say anything that makes the case for you, and this idea that all the lies that you've told over the last 4 years somehow can go away and have no sense of either accountability or no sense of responsibility.
I want to talk about getting to the middle here for a second.
You can't go to the middle though, Joni, without
just hear me out. Just hear me out.
Pollster Stuart Elway has always described Washington politics for a long time like Neapolitan ice cream. 1/3 Democrats, 1/3 Republicans, 1/3 independents. So I called Stuart last week and said, that's in the background. That's what you've said for a long time. But what about now? And now the numbers are Republicans are at 24%. Their all-time low was 18% in 2009. Democrats are at 40. Their all-time low, 25 in 1995. Independents, 36. So, Tina, don't both parties need the independents? The independents, that's a big number. Don't both parties need to moderate to capture them when people are voting?
I think what we need to do is make sure that we are doing the work to have the best government we possibly can to take care of people. And that you start that again with free and fair elections in terms of who's elected and who's making those decisions to do that sort of work. I think from a Republican Party standpoint, I mean, you have to be in a place where it does make sense for individuals within their own towns, within their own cities. It's a joke, though, to hear Caleb talk about fiscal prudence when Trump increased the national debt by.
Again, Tina's going to talk about Trump, talk about D.C. and try and smear every Republican. Apparently, from now until the next, who knows, Tina, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, you're not going to talk about what's actually happening in Washington State, what Republicans
I'll tell you what's happening in Washington.
doing, what
Right,
Bruce
which is
Standmeyer has
nothing.
done in Pierce County for the last 4 years.
Let him finish.
Consecutive.
Let him finish. Let him
What
finish.
Nate Nearing is doing in Snohomish County, like you're trying to smear Republicans with a national narrative because that's how you think you can win elections. So you're not even willing to have an honest intellectual debate.
We're going to have an honest conversation.
What the policy is in our state, what the policy is in our community. You just want to smear people with a national political brush, and that's a disservice to our democracy. Like,
So
let's
Caleb, I have a
debate
question
about
for you.
What the issues are here
I
locally,
have a question for you.
What's facing our communities, what's happening in Olympia, and Republicans will win on that debate.
So I have a question for you, Caleb, on the numbers that I read you from Stuart Elway.
Does your party, since you're not at your all-time low, but you're at a low, does your party need to do some soul searching itself and reaching out to independents because they're such a big group? What does that look like?
Well, absolutely. I think as the Republicans that I've highlighted, I mean, Kim Wyman won with 53%. So she was appealing to independents who trusted her to administer elections better than the Democrat challenger and better than Tina 4 years ago. So Kim Wyman has won those independents. You look at the local level, Bruce Standmeyer won in Pierce County with 55%. And so Republican candidates selectively do win over independents. And I think that is a model. When we talk about the problems in our communities, the problems at our state level, and we offer pragmatic solutions, that's the path forward for Republicans. And what I would hope is that Democrats will have a good faith debate and discussion about those very real problems and listen to the voices of the people of Washington State that are represented by Republicans. Lauren Culp got 43% of the vote. He got 1.7 million Washingtonians who were voting for him. They deserve to have a voice in our state government. They deserve to be heard as well. And that's what Republicans are representing and who they're representing. And those people deserve to have a seat at the table and deserve to have their voice heard. And that's why the Republican Party is going to continue to exist and to continue to advocate for people that have those types of concerns.
To that point, I have a question from the audience from someone named Casey. It's for both of you, but we're going to run out of time so tight here. Do you support ranked choice voting and allowing additional parties into the current two-party system? Tina, you go.
From the platform of the Democratic Party, we are supportive of looking at ranked choice voting and implementing that. Secretary of State Kim Wyman, the Republican, has made it clear she does not support ranked choice voting. So there's a bill going through the legislature right now to look at ranked choice in a variety of jurisdictions. Obviously, many cities have had it. State of Maine has had it and made it work. So we're looking at ways to increase participation of voters in Washington State.
Caleb, your quick take on that.
So my quick take is I live in Pierce County. We had ranked choice voting in Pierce County from 2008 to 2015, and then the voters did away with it. It was confusing in Pierce County when you had vote by mail. We ended up with a guy named Dale Washam, who was like a multiple-time candidate, ended up working his way through, and he was a disaster, and he totally bombed our Pierce County assessor office. So I think there's some concerns there. Philosophically, I'm okay with the idea, but I think it's in practice, there's some things that have to be ironed out.
A lousy implementation doesn't mean that the idea was bad. It means that it was a lousy implementation.
Well, it was implemented by Democrats in the Pierce County Auditor's Office, so I don't know if you want to go attacking people, Tina.
So hang on. In the interest of
moving along and trying to get rid of some things that are sort of, causing us to be less civil. What about the role of social media, specifically Twitter? How does that make all of us sound less like we like each other?
Caleb.
I mean, I think that social media with sound bites, with dehumanizing the people that you're talking to or talking at, I think is a disservice in that regards. I think that if we're going to find agreement, if we're going to solve the issues facing our communities, it's going to be much more effective with people face to face. And that's, if you want to bring people together, if you want to diffuse polarization, it's going to be people talking to people at parks, talking to people in their community. And that's when we're going to find that we actually agree a lot more than we disagree. When you're just attacking people on Twitter, which is often what Twitter descends into, clearly that's not going to help solve any big issues.
Tina, I would ask you something because I kind of cut you off there trying to steer the conversation forward. And I'm going to come back to it, something you said. When you and I talked, you said this, and you said this a little bit tonight. We are in an adversarial situation, but being adversarial doesn't necessarily mean lack of respect. So how do we get people to realize that we can disagree and still be speaking respectfully?
Well, you have to start with the truth, right? I mean, that's a component of this. You think about what Caleb just said a minute ago about Twitter. And honestly, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the party at the national level or the party at the statewide level. The person who's at the head of it sets the tone. So in this case, if you look at the tone that was set by Donald Trump, for 4 years, Caleb did not object to a single thing Donald Trump said on Twitter. He did not.
That's not true. That is not true.
Well, let's ask him. Did you object to anything on Twitter?
Yes, and I was asked about it multiple times. I was asked about it multiple times in the media by Brandy Cruz, by Jim Bruner at the Seattle Times, and I specifically spoke out against some of the
let's
No.
What did you
like? I don't agree with them, and I did. I mean, so for you to say that I didn't is just not true.
You did not speak out about those tweets. You didn't say the tone and the tenor of the tweets. You didn't do that. You look at
I did.
From the people within your own party, and you don't speak out about those things. And to me, this is the part of this that is kind of so absurd. The Republican Party is trying to fight for some relevance. It's fighting for its life. It is a party that has been marinated in talk radio and conservative media, and their unifying goals are not making people.
What about that? What about the role of the media? Tina, when you and I spoke, you talked about, it was a 24-hour news cycle. Now it's a 24-second. It's a little, hyperbolic, but it's really fast, and the media is possibly contributing as well.
Well, and it's being used, right? The Republicans have found that their unifying goals are really attacking outsiders and owning Democrats. That was the whole point of Caleb and his conversations here today, is to try to gotcha and own Democrats. But at the same time, let's go back to the issue of the truth and what I started my comments with, which is the commitment. If you want to have a functional democracy and you want partisanship and functional bipartisanship to work, you have to have the commitment to abide by the results of free elections and don't lie about them. You have to be able to tell the truth about those elections, and you have to make the commitment that all citizens have equal opportunity to participate in the electoral process.
And I have to ask you to hold that thought so I can close in a timely way.
We have been discussing bipartisanship, even reconciliation, with Tina Podlodowski from the state Democrats and Caleb Heimlich from the state Republicans. We're coming back next month with two leaders for the Democrats in the U.S. House, Representatives Pramila Jayapal and Susan Delbene. They are both from our Washington congressional delegation. Thank you all so much for joining us, and good night.